Tonight is part 2 of the Old Testament survey. As you can see on the slide in front of you, it says session 2, literature. Last week we talked about the history. Tonight we're talking about literature. Next week we're going to talk about the theology. So the idea here is that we're looking at the Old Testament from 3 different vantage points to help you understand it. Just a very quick reminder about last week. You remember that Abraham was at 2000 BC, David was at 1000 BC, and of course Jesus is at 0. But I showed you, as far as a way to remember and keep the history of the Old Testament organized in your mind, is that it comes in groups of 400 basically. That overview that helps to keep it organized for us. The other thing that I mentioned that's very quick on the overview is that the journey in the Old Testament is from Babylon to Canaan, to Babylon, to Canaan, right? And between those, we have a couple dips down to Egypt and back, and Egypt and back. And so that just hopefully helps to put it all together for you so that you can keep track of where we are in the Old Testament. So today we're going to do literature, which means we're going to give an overview of the books themselves. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. Of the 39 in the New Testament, the Old Testament, it divides into 4 sections, right? It's going to divide into 4 sections. The sections are going to be the Pentateuch, which is the 5 books, the 5 books of Moses. And then we're going to have historical books, poetry books or wisdom literature, and then the prophecy books. So as far as how this works out, I gave you last week, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, that handles the first 2 400-year periods. The period of the patriarchs is the book of Genesis, and then the other 4 books are basically the 400 years of slavery in Egypt and the Exodus from Egypt. So the Pentateuch handles the first 2 of those 400-year segments. The historical books are the monarchy. After the kingdom had divided into the northern 10 tribes of Israel and the southern 2 tribes of Judah. And it goes through the various lists of kings that they have. The historical books handles Joshua and Judges. So it's the 400 years of the Judges. It's the 400 years of the monarchy. So the Pentateuch handles the first 2 400-year periods. The historical books handles the next 400-year periods. And then we have the poetry books or the wisdom literature. And those are the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and the book of Job. And then the last segment of the book, prophecy, that covers the last 400-year segment. So you can see, I'm trying to help you see that the outline that I gave you last week of all these 400-year segments, that's also how the literature fits in so that you can understand how this flows into how the literature flows into the history, right? So we've got the Pentateuch, the historical books, the poetry books, and the prophecy books. Sorry, I was supposed to be popping those on while I was talking to you. Again, the Pentateuch covers the first 2 400-year periods. The historical books covers the next 2 400-year periods. The prophetic books the 400-year period. So hopefully that will help you keep it all organized, if that helps. So we're going to go, but sort of a book at a time. I was going to say some of the most important books in the Old Testament, but that's not fair. All of the books in the Old Testament are important. But the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, that is, the Pentateuch is a word that means the book of 5, or the 5 writings. And that refers to the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is in what Judaism is known as the Torah. The first 5 books, if you ever talk with a Jewish person, this is the Torah. To us, and as Christians, it's the Pentateuch, the 5 writings. Torah means instruction. And so we go. So if you wanted to think of it as a 5-volume book with unified themes, or understand it. Traditionally, the Pentateuch or the Torah was written by Moses. And we'll talk about that a little bit right now. Many scholars now, you should know, many scholars now discredit Moses as the author. But I think the evidence is still in the favor of Moses. I think that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch. And in that sense, I would disagree with most scholarship nowadays, but I still think Moses was the author, but that has to be conditioned by certain explanations. So let me talk about that. First of all, we know for a fact that Moses did not write it in the form we have now, because Hebrew did not yet exist as a language in 1300 BC when Moses was alive. Hebrew did not exist. Hebrew was not invented until roughly 400 years later. You know how English evolved? If you ever try to read Beowulf, or even sometimes read the Declaration of Independence, some of the language is not the way we use it now, because languages evolve. Hebrew had not yet evolved in the time of Moses. There was no such language as Hebrew. And since the copy we have is in Hebrew, we understand that it was translated later. It was put into Hebrew in later centuries. So therefore, we know that there were assemblers and there were editors. And I try to put it this way: supposing that I were to write a book called The Quotes of Abraham Lincoln, the material belongs to Abraham, but the assembling and the editing would be mine centuries later. So it's still fair to say that Abraham Lincoln wrote this book, even though technically he did not write the book. I wrote it, but the words are his words. And I think that's a useful way to look at the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, that he didn't write it, but the material is all his. So having said that, let me explain that I am convinced that Moses wrote a lot of it down. He did write it down. All through the Pentateuch, you'll see various places where it says that God told Moses, write this, and he did, and it was written down. And even when we get into the book of Joshua, Joshua talks about the book of the law that Moses wrote down. So Moses wrote something. There are about a dozen other places in the Old Testament where they talk about the law that Moses wrote. Now we know that writing existed in the time of Moses, and so I consider that Moses is the authority behind the book. So much so that I can claim Moses wrote it, even though Moses didn't technically write what we have. Somebody else wrote it, and you can tell it's been edited. But I think it's clearly Moses material. So that's why I say Moses is the author. The books, by my research, were written in approximately 1300 BC, but they were not written in Hebrew because that's impossible. So they've been arranged and edited through the centuries. But I believe, because the Bible tells me so, that the Holy Spirit superintended the process. And what we have here is the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, what we have is God breathed. It's God inspired. It's the God inspired Word of God that I believe came to us through Moses. So hopefully I'm making clear what I mean by Moses wrote it. Now, we'll go on to talk more about the Pentateuch. You saw in the previous chart here that the prophecy, the prophetic books are in two sections, the major prophets and the minor prophets. It's also true that the Pentateuch is in two sections. The first section is Genesis 1 to Genesis 11. These chapters, you should know, are very different than anything else in the Pentateuch. They're a completely different kind of writing and a completely different point to them. They tell us how sin and fallenness messed everything up. I think I mentioned to you last week about the Eden problem, the problem of sin that comes up in Genesis 3, and the Babel problem, the problem of understanding God correctly, and that comes up in Genesis 11. Both of these sections are in this first part of the Pentateuch, and they tell us how sin and fallenness messed everything up and how people don't understand who God is and what he's like. But then Genesis 12 starts a whole new thread, and that thread carries through the rest of the Pentateuch, telling us how God acted to redeem the mess that people had made and how to reconcile us to himself because we had messed everything up and we needed God's intervention. So Genesis 1 through 11 introduces the Eden problem and the Babel problem. Genesis 12 to the end of the Pentateuch, and frankly for the rest of the Old Testament, and frankly for the rest of the Bible, tell us how God is acting to correct what happened in Genesis 1 through 11. And the unifying theme of the Pentateuch is the covenant, the contract between God and humanity. It explains to us who God is and what he has done, who we are and what we have done, and what happens if we obey the contract and what happens if we disobey the contract. So the unifying theme of the Pentateuch is the covenant. And we see a covenant with Adam, we see a covenant with Noah, we see a covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob, and with the children of Israel. So it's really all about the covenant. If you remember that, you're doing well. So let's go into Genesis. So Genesis is what it is the beginning of the story of the covenant. And it's really to tell us why the covenant is necessary. Mostly it's because of the Eden problem and the Babel problem. That's why the covenant is necessary. And I hope I'm giving you sort of mnemonic tools so that you can remember what all this stuff is about, these 400-year sections and how the literature of the Pentateuch and historical books and the prophetic books fit into that historical context. But here we are in Genesis, and we're talking about the Eden problem and the Babel problem. And so the beginning of the story, it's the beginning of the story of the covenant, is what Genesis is all about and why the covenant is necessary. The themes of Genesis are monotheism. There's only one God. He's the only God. He's the only God that will ever be. And about man's sin, there's the Eden problem, and how God has revealed himself to us through the covenant to correct the Eden problem and to correct the Babel problem. So Genesis is about monotheism, sin, God's revelation of himself through the covenant, and God's presence. Now, God's presence is a theme. It's like a river that goes through all of Genesis. God is present with Adam, even though he sinned. God's presence with Noah, God's presence with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God's presence with Joseph. And so it's really about God's presence. It's the story of God ordering everything to be good and humans making a mess of it all, right? And then it's the story of three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. and how the covenant will be fulfilled through their family. That's what the book of Genesis is about. Exodus, the second book, is the next stage of the covenant. It's all about the covenant because its themes, again, are monotheism. There is only one God and Yahweh is him. It's about redemption. It's about the law, God's presence again, and the covenant that even in Egypt, even in slavery, God is present with his people. Even in Egypt, even in slavery, God is faithful to the covenant. Even in Egypt and even in slavery, God is revealing himself to the people and that he plans to redeem them at the end of the period of slavery. So we find out in the book of Exodus that Yahweh is more powerful than any of the false deities that don't really exist. That we find out that God is so powerful, he's able to redeem his people from even a situation as terrible as the slavery in Egypt. And we find out that then he gives them directions for the tabernacle because he wants to live with them and he wants them to live in his presence. So we're starting to learn that the covenant is not just about God revealing himself, but it's also about God having a relationship with his people. That takes us to the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus then is about how to live in God's presence. Leviticus is about sacred times, sacred people, and sacred space. Leviticus is about how people can live their side of the covenant so that God's presence stays with them. As you read through Leviticus, it becomes obvious that the people have to be holy if God is going to stay with them. God has promised to be their God, but they have to hold up their end of the covenant. Remember, the contract tells us about who God is and what he has done, who we are and what we have done, and about what happens when we obey and what happens when we disobey. And so Leviticus is how people can live in a relationship with God so that God's presence will stay with them. When we get to the book of Numbers, Numbers is their journey. Actually, Egypt. Numbers is really the book of their journey through the wilderness. And when they approach Canaan and they don't have faith, and so they're going to wander for 40 years. So Numbers is all about that wilderness wandering. It's all about getting to Canaan and then blowing it and then wandering for 40 years. And we know at the end of the Pentateuch is when we get to Joshua, and that's where they're going to enter the land. And so Numbers is like a journal of their wilderness period. What we find out in Numbers is that God is faithful. God is faithful even though his people are sinners. God is faithful even though his people are faithless. God is faithful, and so it's about his presence and the covenant. You see how the covenant just is through all of this. And the people's lack of faith, Numbers is all about their terrible lack of faith. They don't, they complain about the manna, they complain about Moses, they complain about their conditions. They want more meat, they want more water, they want, Numbers is just a book about the people's terrible faithlessness. But we're learning about God and we're learning about the covenant because God is staying with them anyway, because God is faithful. That's what we're learning. Now, God does punish them. God does punish them for defiance. God punishes them for their rebellion. So we're learning about God. God is full of grace, but there's also consequences to our behavior. And the book of Numbers is showing us how the covenant works. that when they obey, they're blessed. When they disobey, they're judged. And that even when they're judged and they're disobedient, God is faithful and he's sticking with them anyway. And he's revealing himself to them. Whether they are faithful or faithless, God still is revealing himself to them and trying to draw them into relationship. And then the fifth book of the Pentateuch then is Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy, you should know, is just like a longer version of the second half of the book of Exodus. It's as if we took the second half of the book of Exodus and expanded it into a whole book by itself. And the themes of Deuteronomy are monotheism. We've seen that theme before. We saw it in Genesis and we saw it in Exodus. It's about worship. It's about the law, which of course is what in Exodus was all also, and how important it is to obey God. That's what Deuteronomy is about. It's about the covenant. So you can see the Pentateuch is all about the covenant. Genesis is how the covenant started. Exodus is more of an explanation of the covenant. Leviticus is about sacred space, sacred time, sacred people. Numbers is the book of showing us about the covenant through the people's faithlessness. And Deuteronomy is showing us the importance of the covenant through the people's obedience. So we're getting all kinds of different sides of the covenant. So that's what the Pentateuch is about, just as a quick overview. It's about God's presence. It's how God is dealing with the sin problem and the Babel problem, and he deals with it by the covenant, which is how he reveals himself and relates to the people. So hopefully that helps. So we can go on to, I'm looking to see if there are questions. In case you want to take a little break here and see if there are any questions about the things I've said about the Pentateuch so far. If there aren't any that are jumping out, we'll move on to the historical books. Remember, the Pentateuch was covering the first two 400-year periods. The first 400-year periods was the time of the patriarchs. That's the book of Genesis. And the other four books of the Pentateuch are about the next 400 years, which is the time of their slavery in Egypt and their exodus and their wilderness wanderings. Okay, I don't see any questions, so we'll just jump on to talk about the historical books. Now, the historical books covers the next two 400-year periods, which is the time of the judges, Joshua and Judges, and also the time of the united monarchy and the divided monarchy. So again, that divides into two also. See the patterns here. Genesis divides into two parts, Genesis 1 through 11, and then 12 and following. The prophetic books divides into two parts, the major prophets and the minor prophets. And in the same sense, what was I saying? The historical books covered the two periods of Joshua and Judges, and then the monarchy and the two parts of the monarchy, the united monarchy and the divided monarchy. Now, even though these are historical books, they're really more theological than they are the annals of history. You know, the historical books do not read like the textbooks you studied in school. That's not what the historical books are. What the historical books are is giving us a theological interpretation of history. What the historical books are showing us is that God is involved in everyday life, and therefore God is realistically affecting the flow of history. And that's a very important point that the Bible's trying to make, that it's not just history, it's his story. History. God is involved in everyday life. God is involved in political movements. Now, that doesn't mean he's involved in every political movement, but history is not out of control. God is involved in everyday life, and God is realistically affecting the flow of history. So it's not necessarily by fiat where God is working us all like puppets. We are not puppets in God's hands, but God is involved in the incremental everyday changes in how a person lives his or her life. And that's what the historical books are about, because it's showing us how people operate in relationship with God, just like we were seeing in the Pentateuch. That was telling us about people's relationship with God, and that's what the covenant was about. In the historical books, we are learning that what is happening here is that God is involved in everyday life, and people interact with him, and some people are faithful to the covenant, and some people are faithful to the covenant. Some people obey it, some people disobey it, and so we're learning what God is like, when he's gracious, when he judges. We're learning how he is dealing with the Eden problem and the Babel problem. I keep repeating these because I want you to see how all of this ties together, right? In other words, these historical books are not just history books, they are about the same thing that the Pentateuch was about. What is God like, and how can I live in relationship with him? That's what they're about. They're about the covenant, showing us real life, the covenant blessings and the covenant curses. And when Israel does what is evil in the eyes of the Lord, there's judgment. And when they do what is right in the eyes of the Lord, there's blessing. And to that end, we have two different books that show us those in stark contrast. The book of Joshua shows us what happens when a nation obeys the Lord. The book of Judges shows us what happens when a nation does not obey the Lord. In the book of Joshua, the people come in, they conquer the land, they see miracles, they are successful, they settle the land and start becoming prosperous. In the book of Judges, we generally see one mistake after another, horrible situations in some cases, things that are very disobedient. But what we find out through the book of Judges is that God is faithful to them anyway. Be destroyed. He keeps raising up judges to help them and to teach them, because God is a very patient God, and so he's trying to direct them towards a relationship with himself. So that's what we see in Joshua and Judges. The book of Ruth is about faithfulness and about redemption, the same themes that we've seen in other books of the Pentateuch, the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. The book of Ruth is about the same thing, faithfulness and redemption. Now, Ruth also gives us an introduction to this character named David that is going to be one of the key players in the Old Testament. Remember, back to our summary, Abraham in 2000, David in 1000. The book of Ruth is going to introduce David to us. He's still a couple generations away at the end of Ruth, but it's the introduction. So Samuel, the book of Samuel and the Kings are about God choosing David. Before David, there was a king named Saul, whom the people had chosen. Terrible choice. But God is faithful to them anyway. God doesn't let them just be destroyed, but he raises up David to represent him. And we read in the book of Samuel and Kings, we read about God's choice of David and his ascent to the throne and the Davidic line. Now, which is not to say David is a particularly noble character. I was very surprised about 10 years ago when I was actually teaching a study on the life of David. And I had always had this impression that David was a hero because we read that he was a man after God's own heart. And of course, we know about the David and Goliath story that he had about that in 1 Samuel 17. But if you go chapter to chapter in David's life, the guy had a lot of problems, but God is faithful anyway. And God has promised in his covenant that the kingdom uh, okay, am I back? Am I back? Okay. My goodness. Is everybody there? Lost you for, oh, yes, 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 yes. Okay, people are saying I'm there. And I noticed now there are some questions here. Why didn't I see those before? Okay. Since I got interrupted anyway, talking about the historical books, the question here Desiree asked is, why do we need an extended version of Exodus? Exodus, because we're traveling in the wilderness, and Exodus is more or less an overview of what happened there. Now, there's a lot more that happened in the wilderness during the Exodus, and so the book of Deuteronomy covers some of that extended period. It's just volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, 4, and 5, so that we're getting the so in the book of Exodus, we're getting an overview. In the book of Deuteronomy, we are getting an expansion of the thoughts. Let me see. And then Desiree asked later, what happened in that second part of Exodus where we need a more detailed account? The book of Exodus only has about 4 chapters of law. Exodus 20, which is where the 10 commandments are, and then Exodus 21 to 23, which is a section of Exodus called the Book of the Covenant, or the Book of the Law. And it is that, Exodus 20 to 24, that is expanded in Deuteronomy. From Exodus 25 to the instructions on the tabernacle, and instructions on what the priests are to wear and who the priests are. It's sort of like a constitution, you know, with all the technical details. And so this law that was given in Exodus 20 to 23, while Moses was on the mountain, Mount Sinai with God, are expanded in Deuteronomy. So we get a fuller of what we need to know about the covenant, if that helps. Then Desiree asked, is Leviticus just about sacred times, sacred space, and sacred caretakers? Yes, that's what it's about. And it's about all of the sacrifices. The sacrifices are written in Leviticus 1 through 7. And it's about various rules and laws like dietary laws and Sabbath laws. It's about how the priests are to take care of sacred space, how they're supposed to trim the lamps, how they're supposed to do the sacrifices. Yes, that's what it's about. Was it given before, after, or during the wilderness period? I think it was given during the wilderness period. All of this was revealed, I believe, while Moses was their leader, and it was given to Moses, and he wrote it down. And so I see Moses as the author. He was the one that God was talking to. In that sense, he had a prophetic role. Moses is an interesting guy. Moses was a prophet, a priest, and a king. In a sense that he was the leader of the nation, so king sort of loosely defined. He was a priest until Aaron was ordained. Moses, the one who interceded to God for the people, and he was the mediary between God and the people. And Moses was also filled a prophetic role. There are very few people that fulfill the role of prophet, priest, and king in the Bible. One is Samuel, one is Moses, one is Samuel, and the other is Jesus. Of course, Jesus is the ultimate prophet and priest and king. So, yes, it was given during the wilderness period. So, if that helps, this is weird not to be able to talk to you, but we can open the microphones later. Let me continue. Now I'll get back to the historical period. I was talking about Samuel and King were about David's choice and his ascent in the Davidic line. And they're also about the covenant and God's presence. Now, the book of Chronicles, I told you, remember 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, we don't know when they were written, but they record this time of this 400-year period of the monarchy. The books of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we know were written later. I mentioned to you last week that Chronicles were possibly the last books of the Old Testament to be written. Possibly Malachi was, but possibly Chronicles were. In the book of Chronicles, it rehearses, if the Chronicles were written in about 400 BC, 450 BC, the Jerusalem has been destroyed years earlier. The people have been in exile in Babylon. They have returned from exile in Babylon. And under Ezra and Nehemiah, they have restored Jerusalem a little bit. And so what the books of Chronicles are about is that they go back and retrace the footprints of David and Solomon and all of the other kings. And it shows us 400 years later how God is still faithful, that the remnant of God's people still exists, that they still have the law, and that worship is still central. And the Chronicles are a retelling of Samuel and the Kings and showing us that there is still hope for Israel. The books of Chronicles are a story of hope for Israel, and that repentance is the path to reconciliation. They can be reconciled to God if they will repent from their sins. And so, in a sense, it's the same themes that we saw before, but a slightly different emphasis. Now, during that time, I already mentioned that Ezra and Nehemiah, they were part of the return. When Israel was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, Jeremiah prophesied that 70 years later, they would return. And that is exactly what happened. In 586 BC, they were carried off to Babylon. And it's during those times that we have the books of Daniel and Ezekiel when they are in Babylon, and they return under King Cyrus 70 years later, just as Jeremiah had prophesied. Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra particularly in about 516 BC, brings some people back. Nehemiah is about a little bit later. Nehemiah comes with a group of people and they rebuild the wall. As you know what the book of Nehemiah is about, they rebuild the wall. And now Jerusalem is a city again. And there are Jewish people in the land of Israel. And it's during that time when we get some of the prophets, Zechariah, that prophesies a time of restoration for Israel and a time of when Israel's enemies will be defeated. We get the prophecy of Malachi. It talks about one of these days someone will come and pave the way for the Lord, that Elijah will return. And so that's what Chronicles and Malachi and Zechariah are all about. And they also happen during that 400-year period of the prophetic books. And then we also have the historical book of Esther. And Esther is unique in the Bible in that in the book of Esther, the name of God never appears. The word God is not in the entire book of Esther. It's the only book in the Bible that the word God doesn't appear in. But what we learn from Esther is that God is at work behind the scenes, that God is always at work behind the scenes of history. His presence may not be obvious, but he's there. And just as Joseph said in Genesis 50, you couldn't tell that God was at work, but he was. And so Book of Esther has the same kind of idea in it, that you can't necessarily tell that God is at work, but he is. And so that's sort of the close then of the historical books. From there we can talk about are there any questions about the historical books? I should look to see if you are all actually still there, and whether you have questions at this point before we move on to the the poetic books, not the prophetic books, the poetic ones. Okay, I'll keep watching over in the question bar to see if anything shows up. So then we can talk about a little bit. The poetic books are what we would really, even though they are poetry, they are really books about wisdom. What we're finding out through the poetic books, the wisdom books, if we want to put them that way, is that this is how God runs the world. Again, we are learning about the covenant, that God runs the world according to his wisdom. The poetic books, the wisdom books, include an awful lot about human suffering. The book of Job, obviously, human suffering. But a lot of the Psalms, we read about David and some of his agonizing experiences where he feels oppressed and he feels persecuted and he feels like he's in the pit, where he feels like God has forsaken him. We learn a lot about pain and suffering in the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And so there's an awful lot in these poetic books of wisdom. Oh, there's a question. We have a couple questions here. Were Zechariah and Malachi written at the same time as the Chronicles? Probably, yes. We don't know exactly when they were written. We have very little to go by as to when they were written, but yes, Zechariah and Malachi were probably written at the same time as Chronicles in the 400s BC. Malachi was probably written in about 440 BC. Obviously, the Chronicles were probably written right about that time. Zechariah was in that same pocket, maybe 460 BC, 450. It's very possible that Zechariah and Malachi knew each other, just like Micah and Isaiah probably knew each other, and Ezekiel and Daniel probably knew each other. Yes, they were written at the same time, all in the 400s, right before that last 400-year period that I talked about last week, the 400 years of silence. Yes. And then Ken asked, all I hear of the Torah are used by Jews. Do they have the rest? Yes. Yes, they have all 39 books. They put them in a different order than we do, but they have all 39 books of the Old Testament. They call it the Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K or T-A-N-A-K-H. They call it the Tanakh. But the first 5 books in Jewish mentality, the first 5 books are the most important. Those are the books of the Torah. And then they also have the, what is it called in Hebrew, the Kethuim, I think. They have the prophetic books, the poetic books. They group them sort of the same way we do. But they have the same, all of the same Old Testament text, yes. But the Torah is what's important to them, the books of Moses, the books of instruction, if that helps. Sure, you're welcome. So we're back to the books of wisdom then. They're about how God runs the world according to wisdom, not according to the way things look. If you look at how things look in the world, you'd wonder, what is God doing? What is he up to? And that's sort of what the book of Ecclesiastes is about. Certainly the book of Job. The book of Job is mostly about the retribution principle. And what I mean by the retribution principle, it's the way a lot of people think the world works. The retribution principle is that in this life, good people get blessed and bad people get punished. And that's what the book of Job is really about, where Job is basically asking God, really, is that how the world works? Because that's sure not what it looks like. But God says in the book of Job, no, you're perceiving it right. That is not how the world works. God runs the world by his wisdom, not by the retribution principle. If you read the prophet Habakkuk, Habakkuk is complaining. How come the godless people seem like they're getting blessed? And how come the godly people seem like they're getting oppressed? What's up with that, God? And God tells Habakkuk, that's not how I run the world. The world does not run by the retribution principle. The world runs by God's wisdom. And in God's wisdom, we don't always understand, because it's not always that the good people get blessed and the bad people get cursed. That's not the way it works. And that's what the book of Job is about. It's about that God runs the world by wisdom, not by the retribution principle. The book of Psalms, obviously, is about God's sovereignty and that he is worthy of our worship. See, in the midst of all the evil and the pain and suffering, God is sovereign, God is wise, and he is worthy of our worship. And in the book of Psalms, we get a lot of revelation about what God is really like. God is addressing the Babel problem in the book of Psalms, what God is really like and how the world really works. And the world does not work according to the retribution principle in the book of Psalms, because there are times when David says, hey, I was innocent and I am getting chased around the desert. And the answer is, yep, that's right. You were innocent and you were chased around the desert. Yep. Welcome to life, because it does not work by the retribution principle. It works by God's wisdom. And the book of Proverbs then follows that, explaining to us what God's wisdom is all about. Proverbs is specifically called wisdom literature, and it tells us right in the first chapter, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. That's where we find wisdom, is in a relationship with God. Where we find wisdom is in the covenant. Where we find wisdom is in God's presence, not in the circumstances of life. The life doesn't work that way, but wisdom is found in a relationship with the God of the covenant. See? And that the way of wisdom is the way to live, not the way of circumstances. See, this is what Proverbs is about. So you see why all these tied together as wisdom literature. And wisdom leads us to an understanding of how the world works, and it's not the retribution principle. Now in Ecclesiastes is very obvious that suffering and frustration are a part of life. It's a direct rejection of the retribution principle. The good and bad must be accepted by everybody, no matter who you are, no matter what you are like. You're going to have good parts in your life, and you're going to have bad parts in your life. And so that's the retribution principle is not how things work. Things work according to God's wisdom. And that purpose in life is found through a God-centered worldview. That's how the world works. Because we relate to God, we follow his covenant, and we engage him in relationship. And then Song of Solomon is just a whole different kind of book. Song of Solomon is about human relationships, and even what human relationships teach us about God. All of us who have been around the block a few times, we understand that, human relationships mirror a whole lot about the Eden problem for sure, and about the Babel problem, and about what a relationship is all about, and how we love, and how we find love, and how we have a relationship with God. And so those are the books of wisdom. So I should go on then to the final setting of the book, and those are the books of prophecy. Now the books of prophecy fit into the final 400-year period of the sequence, besides the 400 years of silence that comes after Chronicles and Malachi. We get the 400 years of silence, but here we have 400 years of prophecy that lasts from basically somewhere in the 800s, from about 850 BC to roughly 440 BC. So almost exactly 400 years that we see this time of the prophets, all the way from Elijah, all the way down to Malachi. And we have the books of prophecy. Now the books of prophecy are divided into two groups. Just like we see two groups in a lot of other settings as well. There are the major prophets and the minor prophets. Now, interesting, the major prophets, there are 4 of them: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Again, numerology is very important in the Bible. Numbers have great significance. The 4 and 40 and 400 are often times of symbols of trial, and and we have 4 major prophets that were written during a time of trial. Isaiah was written while Judah was being conquered and they fell. Jeremiah was written after they fell, prophesying 70 years until they would return. And Ezekiel and Daniel were both written while they were in exile. So you can see that these 4 major prophets are during a time of trial for Israel. And then we have 12 minor prophets. Count them, 12. 12 minor prophets. We had 12 children of Israel. We had 12 tribes in Israel. And we had 12 apostles and disciples. So here we have the 12 minor prophets. So I'm not going to go through each one of those books. So I don't want you to get scared like, oh my, I got to brace myself for a siege here because he's going to go through all 16 of these books. No, I'm not. The important thing to know about the prophetic books is that prophecy is not really about foretelling the future. Sometimes the prophets do foretell the future, but prophecy is really about God giving his message to the people. Most of these prophetic books are not foretelling the future. Only pieces of some of them do that. But prophecy is really about the covenant blessings and the covenant curses, where mostly what the prophets are saying is, here's what will happen if you obey, and here's what will happen if you disobey, right? Here's what will happen if you comply, and here's what will happen if you defy. And that's what the books of prophecy are usually about. If you recognize some of the prophetic books, it's the prophets standing on a street corner and saying to the people, you are disobeying God. You need to return to God. In that sense, he's like a street preacher, right? Not like looking into a crystal ball and telling the future. Most of these prophetic books, and you need to understand also that most of these prophetic books overlap each other. Often, several of these prophets are speaking at the same time. Sometimes people are saying, when I talk to them on my website, and they say, why is God so nasty? Book after book after book is talking about his judging the people. Well, in truth, these are happening at the same time. They're 12 different guys talking to the same group of people saying, you need to straighten up and fly right. And if you don't straighten up and fly right, there are going to be consequences. So it's not really God being nasty to the people. And all this God ever does is judge people, because these are just 12 points of light that are talking to the children of Israel saying, come on, obey God, and things are going to go a whole lot different for you. And if you disobey God, there's just going to be trouble coming. So that's what these are about. Most prophecy was rebuking disobedient people. Just like when Jonah went into Nineveh and said, in 40 days, you're toast. You're done. Sorry, game over. And so that is often the message of the prophets, not foretelling future events. The messages of the prophets are basically of four kinds. First is the message of indictment, where the prophet describes the offense. And he describes the offense by standing on a corner, like I said, or going to the king and saying, you've been a naughty boy. You shouldn't be doing that, right? And then the next kind of prophetic message is the message of judgment. Therefore, you're going to sit on the naughty chair for 30 minutes because you went into the cookie jar when I told you not to go into the cookie jar. And so you get a timeout and you're going to sit on the naughty chair for 30 minutes or for 70 years, maybe. And sometimes the prophets give words of instruction. And the words of instruction would be, if we keep going with the cookie jar analogy, the words of instruction is how you're supposed to act. And this is where the mama says, from now on, you're going to ask mama first before you take a cookie from the cookie jar. So you see how the prophets are just being a good parent. That's all they're doing. God is not being a jerk. He's not being cruel. He's not being terrible. He's just saying, listen, you've been a naughty boy. You went in the cookie jar when you weren't supposed to. Therefore, you're going to sit on the naughty chair for 30 minutes. And listen, from now on, you're to ask mama first before you take a cookie, okay? And then the fourth kind of prophetic message is a message of hope and restoration. And this is where the mama says, mommy still loves you. And so this is the kind of prophetic message that we are seeing. God is not just being nasty. Now, so that's sort of a summary of the prophetic books. I wanted to recommend two sources to you in case you're interested. The first one is a book I wanted to show you. It's called The Essential Bible Companion. Yes, full disclosure. Yeah, my brother is one of the authors, John Walton, Mark Strauss, and Ted Cooper. Uh, but what it does is it gives, this book is a paperback about maybe a half-inch thick, and it gives a one-page synopsis of each book of the Bible. It tells you what the book is about and sort of gives you some of the keywords and some of the themes, all on a one-page spread. So I guess it's 2 pages technically. It's $12 on Amazon. So that's not going to break the bank, but it gives key insights for reading God's Word. As you can see in the bullet points underneath, maps, themes, timelines, key people, and terms. I have found it to be a very useful book. And the other recommendation I have for you is something that's online. So it's totally free. It's called the Bible Project. It's called the Bible Project. It's on YouTube. It's a series of generally 6 or 7 minute videos about each book of the Bible, about what the book is about and what's happening in the book. And I have found these to be excellent. They are just excellent. I've even referred them to my grandchildren who attend your church. And I said, even children can watch this and understand. And so Matt and Becca watch it with their kids and they talk about it because it explains each book of the Bible in about 6 or 7 minutes. They're really excellent. But as an adult, I watched them and I learned some things from them. They're really useful. They're free on YouTube, called the Bible Project. So if that's helpful to you, hopefully that explains then the literature of the Bible. So maybe you want to unmute your microphones and actually talk to me instead of writing with what questions you might have. We've been about an hour, but I've reviewed the literature of the Bible so that you have understanding of what the books are and what they're all about. You want? Oh, here's Desiree has a question. Okay, she wants me to expound more on the Babel problem. I know that God confused the languages because if they could build that tower together, what other terrible things they could do together, right? That's not exactly what was going on at Babel. Let me explain to you about what's really happening at Babel is that they were going to build a tower that reached to the heavens, basically so they could change how God worked. What the ancient world believed is that God worked in a certain way, and that but if they built the tower without building it, that they could make God work the way that they could conform God to their image, that they could make God the way they wanted him to be. And so God said, I'm not going to play that game. And it says in Genesis 11, probably around verse 5 or so, where it says, and God says, I'm going to go down there, but I'm going to go down there on my own terms. I am not going to go down there on their terms, because I am not going to let the people make me the way they want me to be. I am the way I am. And so God went down and he confused their language, which means that basically he dispersed them into other people groups because they had misconstrued the nature of God. And this is sort of one of those, often in the Bible we get stories that are first offense stories, that the first time something happens, God shows us what his response to that would be. And we learn from that that's what God's response was to be. And then from there on, we're supposed to take it ourselves. Like in the New Testament, as soon as the church forms, we get Ananias and Sapphira lying to the Holy Spirit and lying to the church. And you remember God struck them dead. Now, God hasn't struck anybody dead for lying to the Holy Spirit and lying to the church since then, but in that first offense, he showed us, this is what I think of this idea. The same thing happens in the book of Numbers, I believe, when they're wandering through the wilderness, and God says to them, somebody disobeyed on the Sabbath, and he was carrying sticks. And so God says, well, he should be stoned to death because he's desecrating God. Now, nobody's been stoned to death for collecting sticks on the Sabbath since then, but God has already let us know what his opinion is of people blaspheming him and taking him casually. And so he does not cater to that. So the story of the Tower of Babel is the same kind of story. It's like a first offense story where the people are trying to make God into what they want him to be, as if we get to tell God what he's like. And God is saying, you don't get to tell me what I'm like. I tell you what I am like. And then it's up to you to respond appropriately. That's what the Tower of Babel story is really about. Desiree is also saying she can attest to the Bible Project. It's really helpful. Yes. All right. So does anyone have any questions? We've talked about the literature of the Old Testament and how it fits into the structure, the history of the Old Testament, and what each book is about. So what questions do you have?
At the end on your
Yeah.
in the document, at the end you have a word here. I don't know what language it is, but is it Maranatha?
Maranatha.
Maranatha.
Maranatha. Yes, it's actually appears once in the New Testament, and it basically means, "Oh Lord, come quickly."
Oh.
Jesus, please return soon, is what Maranatha means. It occurs once in Scripture. Maranatha. Yes. There was a group of churches out in California a number of decades ago that were Maranatha churches. Yeah. So that's what that means. Oh Lord, come quickly.
Okay. Also, in regards to the prophetic books and the major and minor prophets, you said some of them might have known each other. I guess I'm trying to figure out what was like their area of responsibility, like how spread out were they, like where are they situated into where they're writing these prophecies for the people.
Israel is a tiny little country. I don't know if you've ever been there. If you looked on a map, it's about the size of New Jersey, which which means it's a little bigger than Maryland, is all the bigger this whole country is. And when you split that in half and you have the top 10, the northern 10 tribes, they're in a section about the size of the state of Connecticut. That's all the bigger it is. And so when you get a couple prophets that are active, and they're going to be especially active around the king. And so in a country that small, and when the prophets are giving messages of the Lord to the king, they're probably intersecting with each other and interacting with each other to some extent. Now, we can't know for sure. There are very few of the prophets that actually say anything like, well, I was talking the other day with Zephaniah and he told me, yada, yada. We don't hear that kind of thing. But in a country so small, and then after the northern 10 tribes away in 722 BC, all that was left was the southern kingdom. Like I said, probably about the size of Connecticut, and prophets that are moving around, Isaiah and Micah, that were active during that time, they most likely knew each other. And actually, Isaiah and Micah give very similar kind of messages to each other. God was talking to Hezekiah through both of them in very similar language. When they get exiled to Babylon, that's where we have Daniel and Ezekiel. And Daniel and Ezekiel, from the writings, we hear that they are both in the capital of Susa. And so there's no place in particular where it tells us they knew each other, but two prophets of God in the capital city of Susa, it's hard to imagine that they didn't meet for lunch every once in a while, as long as they had their protective masks on and kept social distancing appropriate. But as far as we know, there's every reason to believe they could have known each other. Just the areas were so small, and they were usually talking to the kings. So,
Gotcha. Thank you.
sure. What other questions does somebody have? Do you understand how the writings, how the literature fits into the history? I tried to do it in concepts that are easy to remember, these 400-year pieces, and, hopefully matching the two together. So I hope that's clear, and it helps you remember, because then when you hear sermons or you're at a Bible study or a small group meeting and you're hearing about this, that, you can right away put it in the right 400-year segment and, keep adding to your sort of knowledge about what's going on during that 400-year period and how all these various people and factors interact with each other.
Hi, this is Rita. This is not a question, more of a comment.
Okay.
Just you're putting it in perspective that makes it even more relevant. Like it's not just the story I'm reading. It's just now it falls into pieces.
Yes.
It adds to it makes more sense, and it's just it seems even more relevant when we hear it like this.
Thank you. That's one of the benefits of survey like this, that you sort of get a bird's eye view of the whole shot and you go, oh, now I get it. Now I can see how all these pieces, rather than, when we read the Bible, we usually read just a book at a time, or we read it straight through. And when you read it straight through, you're not getting it in order. When you read it, when you hear it in a sermon, you're just getting a piece here and a piece there. Sometimes your pastor, Matt, might do a 6-week series on the book of Jeremiah or something like that, but that still doesn't show you where it fits into the grand scheme of things. That's the benefit of survey, that you sort of get this bird's eye view of what the puzzle looks like and how the pieces fit into each other. Desiree?
I did. So I see a lot of your things has monotheism, but how can you, especially if you're trying to spread the gospel to people who are the Jewish faith, that it is that the Holy Spirit and Christ were shown in the Old Testament as well, like how God was able to show Himself as a triune God, but yet here you have it showed more so of just Him, just God the Father.
Right. The Old Testament does not show a clear picture of the triune God, which is, of course, why when Jesus came on the scene, the people were not only totally shocked by the things that he was saying, but he was accused of blasphemy, because he was saying God is one, but God is plural at the same time. And the people are going, that's blasphemy. You're not making sense. The Old Testament doesn't say anything about that. Now, the Old Testament does say a lot of things about that, but they're all in hidden pieces. In Jesus on the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24 said he walked with the two people, Cleopas and his friend or her friend, whichever sex Cleopas was, and it says that he explained to him from the scriptures about the Christ. And all of us would paid a lot of good money to have heard that conversation. But then as the New Testament books are written, the New Testament books start showing us at least some of it. This is what was prophesied by Isaiah the prophet. because under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, they're able to look back in the Old Testament texts and say, well, this is what prophesied by Micah, and this was prophesied, this is just what Jeremiah said. And this came from Moses. And the New Testament writers repeatedly write what where Jesus can be seen in the Old Testament. Now, I personally add to that. I happen to think Jesus is on every page. You know, now that we have the full revelation of Jesus that we have gotten from history and from the New Testament. Now we can look back through the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and the Torah, the first 5 books. Now we can look back through those, and you know, certainly we see Jesus at creation, because John 1:3 tells us that Jesus was the medium of creation, that all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. We can certainly see Jesus in the Garden of Eden, when the Garden of Eden talks about the tree of life. Well, Jesus himself said, you know, I am the resurrection and the life. We certainly see Jesus in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 are where Adam and Eve sinned. And we know that the story of Jesus is the story of God dealing with the sin problem. We can certainly see Jesus. You know, I can go through chapter through the whole Bible and talk about where Jesus is in that story. And the Jewish people are looking in particular for, you know, when I talk to them on my website, they say, you know, there are only, and I'll make up a number because I don't know exactly what the number is. You know, there are only 48 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, and they all pertain to, you know, the Messiah coming as a mighty warrior. But, you know, I said the problem is that you're seeing these fingerprints, or if we say it this way, you're seeing these footprints. But I see that the whole land belongs to Jesus, and I don't have to just look at the footprints. I can look at the whole piece of property, and I can see Jesus on every square inch of this plot of land called the Old Testament. You know, we see him everywhere. You know, obviously we see Jesus in David, because Jesus is the second Adam that Paul talks about in Romans 12. Jesus, you know, Peter tells us that really the story of the flood, even though it really happened, that the story of the flood is also a symbol of baptism, and it's a mirror of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul talks about that in Romans 6. We know that Jesus, when, you know, he said that Abraham will be the one that through him, in Genesis 12:3, all the world will be blessed. Well, we know it's in Jesus that all the world is truly blessed. We know that Jesus is the new Moses. We know that Jesus is the real temple. We know that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. We know that Jesus is the prophet and the priest and the king. We know that Jesus, you know, I could go on and on. Jesus is on every page. And so we are not necessarily looking for just these 48 footprints. And again, I'm telling you, I'm just making up that number. We're not just looking at these 48 footprints. We're seeing Jesus all through the scriptures, because he's there. The entire Old Testament points to him. And that's some of the value in knowing what the Old Testament is and reading it and studying it, because we learn so much more about Jesus than we can just from reading the New Testament. It becomes a fascinating look at all the preparation that went into Jesus coming. And you say, well, I don't need to do the preparation. I can just read the New Testament. Well, according to the New Testament writers, we can't, because the New Testament writers time and again are referring back to the prophets, to the law and the prophets for illustrations, explanations, showing, see, Jesus is there. So it's so important that we know the Old Testament.
That was awesome. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. What other questions does anybody have? But next week, I want to look at the theology. Okay, what is it? What is the Old Testament teaching us? You know, I've said it's teaching us about the covenant. It's teaching about the presence of God, but I haven't elaborated on any of those. The sin problem, the Babel problem. Let's talk about it. So that's what, you know, let's sort of get a grasp on what is it that the Old Testament is telling us, teaching us. So that's what next week is. So I hope you'll come back. So let's pray together and we'll be done unless somebody still has a question.